Today's forum is CMC's annual Charles Y. and Frances N. Lazarus Legacy Fund Recollecting Columbus's History Forum, Creative Redevelopment, featuring Jeff Darbee and Nancy Ritchie. Let's thank the Charles Y. and Frances N. Lazarus Legacy Fund and our partners, the Columbus Historical Society, the Columbus Landmark Foundation, and the Ohio Historical Society, which will be officially name changed to the Ohio History Connection on Memorial Day, for their support. That's new information about the Ohio History Connections. And welcome noted expert and historian in their own right, Jeff Darbee, over there, and Nancy Ritchie to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Jeff and I are delighted to be speaking to the Metropolitan Club today. May is Historic Preservation Month, and it's a great time of the year to think about historic preservation and actually how it's impacted our lives in our city. So we'd like to start out, first of all, thanking the sponsors. Among the organizations that preservation would never happen without the Columbus Landmarks Foundation, the Columbus Historical Society, and the Ohio Historical Society. And I especially want to thank the Lazarus family and their role in the history of this city and their continual support of everything that has to do with history and culture and economic development and everything else you do. So we're honored to be here today. What we're going to do, Jeff and I have been involved full-time in historic preservation, and I have to gulp when I say this. Jeff hit 40 years this past March, and I'm up to 38 years, all of it here in Columbus. So we've seen a lot of... I know you're clapping because we're still standing. It's been a fabulous career, but I think it's also, this particular presentation gave us a chance to kind of look back over that history and to really think about how Columbus has changed over time and how historic preservation has been an integral part of that. So we're going to start off by doing a little bit of looking backward to set a context for where we are today and really where the opportunities are and continue to be for Columbus today and in the future. In looking back at preservation in Columbus, I think we could almost date it to the day when the German Village Historic District was established by Columbus City Council back in 1963. And I don't think very many of us were active at that time. I was actually fairly young at that time and in school. But the fact that the city of Columbus decided that the preservation of a neighborhood was a public policy issue marked the beginning of everything else that followed. And I want to put this in context because 1963 was before the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. Columbus was in the forefront of looking at areas. This was the heyday of urban renewal when cities were rushing to tear everything down. And here was German Village convincing the city of Columbus to establish a historic district and set up design review. And what that did, that set the stage for the city of Columbus to also recognize Italian Village and Victorian Village, and ultimately to establish the Columbus Historic Resources Commission. It was a very, very important landmark and the beginning of our timeline in talking about historic preservation. The National Historic Preservation Act came around in 1966, and this was exceptionally important because it established a national program housed at the National Park Service, and it also established a partnership with states. And here in Ohio, our partnership is with the Ohio Historical Society, the Ohio Historic Preservation Office. And it really has been that work over 40 plus years that has resulted in a very robust statewide preservation program here in Ohio, and thousands of people across the state who are involved in historic preservation activities. One of the things that the 1966 Act did was it created the National Register of Historic Places. And I know probably most of you are familiar with the National Register. Actually, as I look around this room, a whole bunch of you live in historic houses, work in historic buildings, and every week you attend a wonderful forum here in this beautiful historic building in downtown Columbus. The National Register, I was looking on a website, we have, just in the city of Columbus, 142 individual properties in historic districts. And some of those historic districts literally have thousands of buildings in them. 314 listings in Franklin County, and we have 3 National Historic Landmarks, the Ohio State House, the Ohio Theater, and the Rickenbacker House. 1969, I love picking up this month's Columbus Monthly, and there's an article about Kappa, and the very first paragraph is, a group of preservationists in 1969 formed Kappa to save the Ohio Theater. I don't think anybody involved in that at that time could have imagined what Kappa would become, or the fact that Columbus would have 4 historic theaters under their management. This is the envy of cities way larger than Columbus, that we have managed to preserve these incredible buildings, and not only to preserve them, but to actually have them be such an active part of the cultural life of the city. Kappa even manages theaters in other cities. And you look at 1969, again, it was urban renewal, theaters were being torn down, downtown was being cleared away, and here was Kappa. I remember this one. 1974, the Franklin County Courthouse was torn down, a magnificent Second Empire building on South High Street. And it was really one of those buildings that got torn down. There was no public discussion of it. And while there might have been some controversy, it was just that idea that everything old, you just clear away for what is progress. I would argue, frankly, it's nice that there's a park. I love the Henry Moore sculpture. I don't think that side of the street, the replacement was worthy of the loss of this building. I'd like to say county courthouses don't get torn down anymore, but in Ohio, it sometimes happens, and it happened relatively recently that we lost a historic county courthouse. 1976. That 1974, people were upset about it, but there wasn't an organized public response. There wasn't really an organization around that was going to say much about what happened. 1976, the Union Station Arcade demolition started at 6 o'clock Friday night of a long holiday weekend. And I had been in my preservation job for exactly 3 months at the time. And Franklin Conaway, who's here in the room, got a judge out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the judge said, this better be good. And Franklin got a restraining order, a temporary restraining order, so that at least the arch was saved. The Citizens for the Union Station Arch was formed as a nonprofit organization. We met every Monday night up in Riverly at the Caskey's house, and Jeff and I had to get married afterwards. We spent every Monday night for 3 years trying to save that arch. It was like, well, let's just continue this partnership. But the important... Yeah, it was the meetings, exactly.
When we got married, it was the meetings.
Yeah, it wasn't every Monday night. Okay. What happened was that core group, and one of those people, Bob Leversige, here today, that core group, along with other like-minded people, formed the Columbus Landmarks Foundation a year later. And what was interesting about the Columbus Landmarks Foundation was its purpose, written in 1977, was, of course, to raise awareness and preserve historic properties, but it was also to be very strong advocates for quality new design. And I understand this so much better now than I did when I was younger, because now we can look back all of those years and realize we're creating the landmarks for tomorrow. What we add to our city in terms of the quality design that we get today is what we hope somebody will care about and want to preserve later. 1978 with the Cultural Arts Center was a really fabulous adaptive use project open to the public, and it was undertaken by the City of Columbus, and many in this room probably remember Mel Dodge, because he was the director of Recreation and Parks for many years. And this might be the project that turned Mel into a preservationist, because he went on to be an advocate for preservation in a number of ways, not the least of which was to preserve the Harrison House, the Sullivan Land Office, and the Deaf School. The Deaf School was actually in the process of being demolished, and Mel Dodge got out of a meeting one day and called the governor, because it was still being held by the state, being transferred to the city and said, stop the demolition, we're not tearing that building down. And today it's undergoing a $12 million renovation. So the Cultural Arts Center, getting recreation in parks, and Alan McKnight has continued that good work, really showed that old buildings could have new uses. We could be creative about what we do. Some of you might remember the Wyandotte building was owned by the state of Ohio for many, many years. It was vacant. In 1978, there was an auction, and I was at the Columbus Landmarks Foundation as an employee at the time, and a lot of us were very, very worried that this Daniel Burnham design building would be demolished. Fortunately, there was a new tax incentive that was introduced in 1976 that only allowed for accelerated depreciation of commercial property. It wasn't the kind of incentive that we have today that can really make projects work. At any rate, it was purchased by a developer, and it was the first project in Columbus that used a tax incentive specifically for historic preservation to be renovated and to be saved, and it's on West Broad Street. You probably recognize it. The North Market. Columbus had 4 public markets at one time. I remember the demolition of Central Market because we always used to go to Central Market. It was the last remaining public market, and there was actually some talk. It was in a Quonset hut at the time, not a wonderful, beautiful, historic building, didn't have air conditioning, heating wasn't very good, and it was kind of falling on hard times. And the city was trying to decide whether or not to renew the lease and continue the function of a public market in Columbus. The North Market actually dates back to 1876, the function of a market at that part of town. And it was really a turnaround by the city in conjunction with the market merchants who said, you know what, we need to not just continue the market the way it is. We need to reinvent the market and make it central to our function as a public market, but also around food and around getting to know the people that produce and actually sell you the food and the whole experience of public markets. Unfortunately, public markets were beginning to go through a resurgence. That led to its move into the historic farm implement building that it's in today, and you can't really imagine Columbus without the North Market. So the big thing that happened in 1981 was Congress passed the first really significant tax incentive to encourage historic preservation. And Jeff's going to talk a little bit more about the tax credits later. But I'd like to just point out some of those buildings through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s that were being rehabilitated. And I'll tell you right now, I can't include everything, but I tried to give a sampling of buildings. So we had, you know, the old post office that became Bricker and Eckler, the Southern Hotel, which almost got torn down along with the Southern Theater, the Carr Building, which was an old plumbing warehouse that actually went through 2 renovations. It was NBBJ, and then it became the Lofts Hotel. A couple of these projects, Berry Brothers Boltworks and Todd's here, Todd Kemmerer, and houses along Town Street in the neighborhood that we're going to talk about later right over here. But 2 of these buildings actually set the stage for whole districts today. The Brewery District, those initial buildings led to the Brewery District. It wasn't just an individual building. It really had an impact, and it became a catalyst for a huge amount of investment over time. The other in the bottom right is the Ohio Moline Plow Building, which became the standard and the centerpiece for the Arena District that followed. So economic development in downtown Columbus has certainly benefited from historic preservation. Going back to 1983, on the left you can kind of see how the short north looked when the trees were just planted. But the idea of taking a whole business district and creating something new out of it, it was an area that was, I guess you would say, notorious. It was the area between downtown and the university area. It was crime-ridden. There were a lot of problems. And the city of Columbus partnered with OSU to create the Neighborhood Design Center using students from the School of Architecture. And it took creative people and people willing to take risks, like Sandy Wood and many of those tenants that moved into those buildings in those early years, many artists, galleries, others. It really began the revitalization of the Short North. And if you haven't been in Columbus for 25 or 30 years, and even we forget how bad it was before this activity and this investment took place.
credit for the qualities it did offer. Even before renovation, there were dining options that included White Castle and Michael's Goody Boy.
That's true. That's
And
true.
they're both still there.
And the White Castle and Michael's
And
Goody
they-
Boy are
they are
still
still
there. So the Short North, and then the Neighborhood Design Center has become an institution in the city and has gone on to work with a lot of other neighborhood commercial areas around town. Their work in the Short North is long over, but the Short North Business Association is active today. The restoration of the Ohio State House stands out because it is one of our National Historic Landmark buildings. It is the reason the city of Columbus is here. We were a capital that became a city. And the important thing about this building was it is part of its public architecture, its civic architecture. Those who were in charge of funding it were able to work in a bipartisan way. There were several governors that were involved, and never did they lose the end goal of making this Ohio State House, this National Historic Landmark, worthy of the people of Ohio. I love the fact that the Columbus Square, or the Capitol Square Review and Advisory Board, they call it the People's House. And it's open to the public, they welcome the public, and it led, I have to believe that it led to a decision by the Supreme Court of Ohio to take on the Ohio Departments building along the riverfront and create the Thomas J. Moyer Judicial Center. The Columbus City Schools bucked the trend of what was going on in Ohio and nationally, where investment in school buildings almost always meant tearing them down and building something new. And in fact, the Columbus City Schools plan to tear down quite a few historic school buildings. And this is where an organization like Landmarks and its efforts at advocacy was able to change that whole pathway. Landmarks worked with consultants and with architects throughout the city to do case studies, to actually look at a number of the buildings slated for demolition and to estimate the cost and to demonstrate to the Columbus School Board that these buildings could be 21st century buildings. And not only could they be 21st century buildings, they could be spectacular 21st century buildings. Most cities have not gone this route. Columbus has really gained national attention. Some of the people I know in this room, some of the architects, Judy Williams worked on it. People that really convinced, made the argument, and it was a dollar and cents argument. But I think these are some of the premier school buildings in the district, and this is only a few of them, and you might recognize them: Ohio Avenue, Fort Hayes, Avondale, and East High School. The probably in our almost 40 years of work in preservation, we noticed the greatest change just a few years ago, particularly in Columbus. And that was really the introduction of the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit. And since Jeff does almost all the tax credit work for our firm, I'm going to let him talk. And I'm just going to change slides. And we're going to talk about how this has had an impact here in Columbus as well.
Well, as Nancy mentioned, I've been here a long time. I came to Columbus to join the Ohio Historic Preservation Office in 1974, and we got into consulting work in 1980 and been doing that ever since. And a significant part of our work is working on projects using the tax credit incentives to facilitate rehabilitation. The work we do is in a very narrow slot where we assist people in the design review process that goes through both the State Preservation Office and the National Park Service. And that's been our work over these well, over 30 years since the credit was created. In fact, the credit took effect January 1st, 1982, and the receipt date at the Preservation Office of our first certification application was January 6th, so we didn't waste any time. And what we've seen over this time, as Nancy's shown you, the preservation ethic, or sort of the belief in preservation, has evolved over time from a focus on individual landmark buildings to whole districts and neighborhoods. But there's been another evolution too, and it kind of goes back to the urban renewal days that Nancy mentioned, where older buildings in central cities were viewed as liabilities, something to be cleared out so that development could occur. And the evolution that's happened is they're now viewed as assets, as economic assets, as opposed to liabilities that are an albatross around the neck of a city. And that's such a huge change. It's made all the difference in the preservation field, and it's so broadened the preservation constituency that it's really become integrated into the development process in almost every city. I've been in Columbus a long time, and I've seen it go from a nice city to a great city, and a good part of that is because of the landmarks and the historic districts that have been preserved and reused. And the credit has to go to the investment credits that were created as economic incentives. The problem historic buildings, older buildings faced was that while there were abundant incentives that encouraged development outside the central city, extension of roads and cities, sewers and water lines and power systems, facilitated suburban development, there weren't comparable incentives for older buildings in the center of the city. Until creation of the federal historic preservation tax credit in 1981 and Ohio's credit, and it joins, I think, roughly another 20 states or so in having this incentive, the credit for the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit. And I won't go into a great deal of detail. When we talk about the credit, it's different from a deduction. A credit is a reduction of taxes owed to the taxing authority by the owner of the building. 20% of qualified rehabilitation expenditures for purposes of the federal credit and 25% for purposes of the Ohio credit. The Ohio credit is a little bit different in that it is partially refundable. If you can't use up all of your tax credit in the tax year in which you're certified, you receive the balance as a check from the state of Ohio, which is a significant incentive. We have worked on probably 100 projects or so over the years, and it all grew out of the efforts of former Representative Chuck Calvert in the General Assembly and current Senator Kirk Shearing, who introduced and shepherded the tax credit, Columbus, or the Ohio tax credit incentive through the legislature until it took effect. It was created in 2006. The first application period was in 2007, and we're up to, Nathaniel, are we up to round 13 coming up? 13th round. When I refer to a round, it's the fact that the credit application period is twice a year, March and September. Approximately $30 million for the state credit is available, each of these rounds. It is a competitive process. And what we found is that the fact that it is competitive, as opposed to the federal credit, which is not competitive, if you meet the qualifications, you get the credit. The state credit is competitive, and what it's doing is resulting in ever higher quality of projects. They're better designed, they're better conceived, they're better funded, they're more likely to be taken to completion as time goes on because the process is competitive. And I think it was intended to work that way, and it is indeed working that way. Not everybody gets funded. More people are finding out about it. And I have to say, Columbus building owners and developers held back a little bit on using even the federal credit for a long time. And I think it really was the state credit that kicked it into gear in Columbus, that building owners and developers here realized what a significant incentive this was and began to participate more fully, the way we had been working in Cleveland for a long time with a lot of developers. We have one client there who's done 12 or 15 buildings using these incentives. So you can combine the federal and the state credit, so the effect is a 45%, up to a 45% credit, and it gets into the complexities of Internal Revenue Service regulations and so on, and we can certainly give you more information if you're interested. But we found that people we wouldn't have thought would be interested in historic preservation projects really have come forward and done projects. And we're working on some fairly significant projects right now. These aren't all ours. These are examples of some of the projects that have gone forward. We're working on the Levesque Tower, the little church building on Long Street. That's an interesting project there because that is linked to significant new construction of apartments. And the little church that used to be the Faith Mission will become the community center for the apartments along Long Street. It's a linkage of the historic building has a function because of the new construction of the apartments. It's a really interesting project. We are working on the deaf school project, the conversion to the Cristo Rey High School, where an old school is becoming a new school. It's a great, it isn't even adaptive use, it's a use of the building for its original purpose. Go ahead and change it.
I was going to say, and Judy Williams is working on
Oh,
the
yes,
Atlas
our
building.
friend Judy Williams is the consultant on that project.
The
That's
Wonder
right.
Bread building
Yes.
in Italian Village and the Seneca Hotel were the other
Right.
two.
Now, why did we get involved in our own rehabilitation project? Well, we built condos on Library Park South, where you drop your books off from your car, back in 1981, when not a lot of condo development was going on in downtown Columbus, but we found an old We call it a carriage house. It was probably a garage. We turned it into 3 condos. It proved to be very livable, and had made a significant investment in that neighborhood. In the early 90s, the Civil War era mansion at the corner of Town and Grant was acquired by a group who decided they didn't want it and wanted to sell the land for a parking lot use. We fought to try to save the building and were not successful, as you can see. And it did become and it remains a parking lot. The condos we had developed were in that block a little farther to the northeast. And it really damaged our neighborhood at the time. Losing that building and taking that chunk out of our block really was painful. But we soldiered on, eventually moved recently into a new house we built on Town Street that has a historic stone facade on it. And there's a story behind that we won't go into. But we do live on Town Street now, but next to us at 380 East Town Street was the old Fred Lazarus House. Now that had been used, some of you may remember Dr. Mallory, the joint implant surgeon. He had used that building as his office and patient space because he was associated with Grant Hospital, so it was convenient for him. But left it some time ago. It had been occupied as a residence. It had been leased out partially as offices, but was empty for some years. We were concerned that the parking lot owners down in Cincinnati would get wind of this property, that the price was continually dropping as it didn't sell. We were afraid we'd lose another building. So we decided we needed to acquire that building and do a rehabilitation, and we've just completed it and turned it into 3 apartments, 2 of which, thank goodness, are already occupied. And
One's
if you're
still
interested
available.
in downtown living, yes, please let us know. But this was the house where Fred Lazarus lived from the 1890s into the early 1900s before moving to Bryden Road. And we found some nice surprises. We found some unpleasant surprises. We found a structural wall we didn't know was there. But these are the sorts of things that happen, and that's why these incentives were created. The idea of the tax credit is not to just give you free money. It is to recognize that occasionally in rehabbing historical buildings you run into unexpected problems, and it's intended to help compensate you or to make more feasible a project that does have issues like unanticipated structural walls. Another thing unanticipated that we found was that buried under some plywood and carpeting was a wonderful parquet wood floor. We had no idea it was there. And I remember the day we realized it was, and we thought, okay, this is good. We don't care about that structural wall. Now, one of the reasons we like to talk about our own project, not just to get the apartment rented, but also because, well, it's also because while this property was on the market, we hear back from realtors that we knew, people have been saying, oh, well, yes, it's an old building, but to use that historic credit, you've got to do at least $1 million project or it isn't worth it. And we're here to tell you that's not true because we spent way less than $1 million on this project. In fact, for purposes of the state credit, and we did apply for and receive both credits, in addition to tax abatement on the improvements because it's in a tax abatement district. And those are all significant incentives. And in fact, for purposes of the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit, there is a set aside for smaller projects where you're not competing with the big $12 million or $50 million projects. You're competing with a pool of smaller projects and have a better chance of being successful. So we have completed our certification, our construction. We've received final certification from the National Park Service. We are anxiously awaiting final certification from the state of Ohio. We know it's in process. And are very pleased to have been able to stabilize this neighborhood, to add to the tax base. We made a long-term commitment to the neighborhood, and we plan to stay there a long time. Affordable housing is an issue that comes up when we talk about preservation because preservation often is, and with some justification, accused of causing displacement, gentrification. Our position has always been that disinvestment, highway construction, urban renewal are much larger causes of displacement of low-income people than preservation ever has been. And in fact, if you look at the record, preservation projects have actually created a significant number of affordable housing units, right here in Columbus and across the country. But if you look at the effects of the federal credit in the years since it began, it's a very significant impact economically. Putting preservation on a paying economic basis is really what's made all the difference. And it's made the economic case for adding these buildings to the asset column of our communities, and they bring with them not only economic value but also those cultural, artistic, those social, emotional values that you can only get from historic buildings that have been part of the community for such a long time. So it's made it okay to believe in those values because economically they make sense as well. That's the big thing that's changed. So roughly a quarter of the housing units created in historic preservation rehab projects are low and moderate income housing units. These are just those are national figures. Here are the investment figures for Ohio. A major incentive ever since creation of the federal credit, and particularly since creation of the state credit. And few, if any, projects have gone forward that haven't combined the two credits. Generally, there's no reason not to combine the two credits. How you qualify for them, we can go into that in detail with you personally if you have any questions about that. Buildings have to be considered historic. They have to have an end use that's income producing. But it's been such a significant incentive. And the rollover, the velocity of the money, you might say, has been tremendous. And these are well-documented figures. A study undertaken by Cleveland State University in Heritage, Ohio, documented these first few years of the state credit and showed a tremendous economic impact. It's job creation, it is stabilization and increase in the tax base, it is increasing the attractiveness of the community. It shows the many ways in which preservation plays a role in the economic development of a community.
And one of the important statistics here is 82% of those buildings were vacant before rehabilitation. So think about what that does for the tax base.
According to the Columbus Historic Preservation Office, they did an analysis and looked at Columbus historic properties, the ones listed either by one of the local commissions or by the Historic Resources Commission. We had a house in German Village for many years, and nobody likes going to these commissions to get approval for doing exterior work. It's not fun, but you know that everybody around you has to do it too, so it's an insurance policy for your investment. And this is proven by studies like this that show these figures. 2% of the land area in Columbus represents 7% of the economic value.
So moving to the present and future and kind of wrapping this up, and if you have questions, start thinking of them, and you know to go to the microphone because we'll wrap this up within about 5 minutes, so get your questions ready and get in line. Just to talk about where Columbus is today. Columbus is a city of just incredible neighborhoods. When we have friends visit or people come from other places, they can't believe the quality of the housing in this city. And we're not just talking about designated historic neighborhoods. We're talking about neighborhoods all over the city. And it's interesting now, we're looking at a lot of mid-century neighborhoods. And one of our favorites is the Westgate area and the Hilltop and the West Side. But we have housing ranging from large mansions to very modest Cape Cods to mid-century housing. Our neighborhoods and the investment in our neighborhoods will continue to pay off for this city. The continued conversion of industrial and office buildings into housing. I have to admit, Jeff and I were very, very worried when places like the Arena District got underway and there were all these vacant buildings and buildings emptying out. And thanks to people who really have vision, many of these are being converted more all the time to residential mixed uses. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Kyle Katz, who's sitting here, and it's not just because he's here, but he was doing this before there was an Arena District or some of these areas downtown. I remember 25, 30 years ago when he bought the Buggy Works, it was way in no man's land. So this is a continuing trend. What we see is so many homegrown businesses are locating in these buildings, and I love going sometimes down streets in historic districts, and all of a sudden these businesses are popping up. And one of the most exciting is at 18th and Oak, where the Angry Baker and Yellow Brick Oven and these little small businesses are locating. The Gay Street area and what's gone on in that area with renovation of buildings and the scale of that commercial district, and the Hills Market downtown. We are so excited about the Hills Market going into a wonderful older building.
But this is only 3 blocks from Hills Market.
But this is where a lot of our entrepreneurs, a lot of our businesses are locating. And it's really interesting to see how many of them are young people. It's telling us something about what's going on in this city, that it really has some momentum along these lines. The Lazarus building is in here not just because of the Lazarus sponsorship, but it as a gold LEED certified building. This is what, 1 million square feet, something like that, to get a gold LEED certification for sustainability, and most importantly, to keep this building in downtown Columbus. We were so worried, again, when Lazarus and City Center closed, what would happen to this building. But I'd also argue that sustainability goes way, way beyond just LEED certification. There's nothing greener than a building that already exists. Reusing existing resources, existing building fabric, existing infrastructure, the density that you get, the walkability, the location to transit, these are all assets that our older buildings have in this city, and this will continue to be a trend. The arts and cultural life of our city are fully integrated with historic buildings and locations. Everything from our theaters, we talked about those, but also galleries, artists, the creative businesses in this community. There's a lot of talk about the creative economy of architects and designers and advertising, much of which is located in older buildings in the city. Columbus is no longer flyover country, and I think that we need to do more to really promote us as a heritage destination. I would put this city up against just about any city in this country, and we could give tours for weeks that could keep heritage tourism busy. We have museums, we have arts venues, we have theaters, we have fabulous parks, we have neighborhoods, we have events, we have a whole local foods and spirits industry as I do this. We'd like to see more of a concerted effort to promote heritage tourism. And I know the Columbus Historical Society has made that one of their priorities. Landmarks, Historical Society, what OHS is planning to do, all of those are front and center. We'd like to see Experience Columbus promote this as a heritage destination. So finally, in wrapping up, preservation is progress. Preservationists for many, many, many years have cared about this city, and while sometimes people think of preservationists as only those people who sit on the boards of local organizations or sit on these commissions, I would argue that virtually everybody in this room is a preservationist, whether you self-identify or not. Think of how many of you have lived in or cared for an older building, historic building, maybe lived in one of our historic areas. Think of how many of you belong to organizations or sit on the board of organizations that are stewards of historic buildings and neighborhoods. Think of how many of you as Columbus Metropolitan Club members come here every week and support this venue. Architects, engineers, contractors, developers, people who make decisions on a daily basis for the benefit of the city and for the benefit of all of us. So the next time somebody says, "Are you a preservationist?" don't say, "No, I'm not one of those people telling you what color you can paint your house." Say proudly, "I'm a preservationist." It contributes to our quality of life, our sense of character, identity. It creates jobs. It stabilizes our tax base. It's good for us. It's not something that's a sideline business. It has to be very much a part of public policy, of every decision we make. It's not that we're not adding new things to this city. We've got to keep doing that, but we don't have to give up the older part of our city and who we are as part of that process. So we are ready to answer questions from any of you. Oh, good. People are getting up. Yay. You know the drill here. You state your name and ask a question, and we're supposed to tell you not to make editorial comments.
Carol McGuire with Columbus Metropolitan Club Board. Thank you both so much. This was absolutely wonderful, informative. Thank you both for all of your efforts in our city. They've certainly yielded some fabulous results for everyone here. I have two questions. I suspect you both each might have a bit of a wish list of things you'd like to see addressed and preserved. So I'd be interested in hearing what you might have in mind. And secondly, are there any historic buildings that are in imminent danger of destruction at this point that you might point out to us that we should be paying some attention to?
I'll answer the second question first. The City of Columbus needs to recognize that the historic Port Columbus building was on the route of the first transcontinental air route. it is significant nationally. It may not be listed in the National Register nationally. It's a beautiful little building on Fifth Avenue. It is in danger of demolition. And Ohio has the Dayton Aviation area, heritage area, which is a national heritage area. I would love to see something appropriate done with that building to recognize Columbus's role in transportation history, in air transportation history in particular. That would be one of the ones on my wish list because I think it's a doable project.
Until 2 weeks ago, the Troutman building on High Street was threatened, but it's not threatened anymore. It's demolished.
Yeah.
But I would like to
That was
see...
the editorial comment.
No, that's just a statement of fact. I'd like to see more of the city's industrial buildings recognized as being significant for their history and architecture, and it's beginning. A lot of it has happened, and we talked about Berry Brothers Bolt Works, and we talked about the
Smith
Buggy Works,
Brothers
and the Smith Brothers Hardware Building, so there's a good start. There are others, particularly on the Franklinton side of the river, and there is beginning to be attention to some of those buildings. Some are already have been reused, others are potential. I'd like to see a concerted effort to help preserve our industrial heritage.
Hi, Jim Coe from WCBE NPR Radio. Thank you. I really appreciate what both of you have brought today. I choose to live in Old Town East, and for an amateur history nerd and architecture nerd that I am, I will find people to agree probably it's the most walkable neighborhood in Columbus. Within 10 minutes of my house, there is such a diversity of architectural styles, as you know. And you mentioned 18th and Oak, and I'm way too close to that intersection because there's Angry Baker, there's Yellow Brick Pizza, and there's going to be more. There's the Tavern. But about a half a mile east of where I live, we had some exciting news just a couple weeks ago about the trolley barns changing hands. Speculate, if you will, what some of the possibilities we might see down there.
That's actually a wonderful question and a somewhat easy answer because we actually worked on a study funded through the Ohio Historic Preservation Office, and we worked with Scully Caldwell on it to imagine what could happen there. And it really, because it's multiple buildings, if you're not familiar with it, it's late 19th century, early 20th century. The multiple buildings provide lots of opportunities, and among the items that were in the study was some live-work artist space in part of the buildings. One of the buildings has wonderful open space in the interior that could very well be some type of venue for special events. It is nestled into a residential area, so one needs to be respectful of not introducing heavy commercial development that would impact the residential area. But that would be another one that would be on my wish list because it has been a very long time in coming and it's been deteriorating for the last 20 years. Another important part of our transportation history, the trolley barns.
And it would need to be incremental because you'll have to take it small chunks at a time.
Is there enough there to preserve them?
Yes.
Okay.
For the time being, it needs attention.
Hi, I'm Bill Lafayette. I'm trustee of Metropolitan Club and a 1923 house in Marion Village.
Great.
But I want to ask about Franklinton. You touched on it briefly. I'd like for you to talk about the possibility of maybe a comprehensive plan to see how much of Franklinton can be saved and repurposed.
I think there has been planning going on in the Franklinton area, and Franklinton presents us with an interesting possibility, and that is we've learned a lot about historic neighborhood development in this city through the other neighborhoods adjacent to downtown, and I would hope that there would be a lot of mixed use. I would also hope that there will be a significant amount of low, moderate income housing in that neighborhood because that's certainly what it's been. And just because it's close to downtown doesn't mean that that should change. But again, there are opportunities to do that with historic low-income tax credits. So, and I hope the scale doesn't change dramatically. It's kind of low scale, it's very intimate feeling. It has, the streets, the sidewalks, and great views of downtown. But I think there has been planning going on, and I know if there is one area that has a lot of active members and always have. The Franklinton area has always been well organized and been very good advocates for themselves.
Good afternoon. Todd Kleismit, work at the Ohio History Connection, which we will soon be.
Gotta learn to say
I want
that.
to thank the both of you for your decades of work pushing historic preservation forward in our community, so thank you very much for that. Toward the beginning of your presentation, you made a very brief reference to a lot of people in the room probably know that the Seneca County courthouse was demolished a couple of years ago. Coming out of that, a number of organizations have come together, and so next week, for audience members who may not be aware, we're hosting a Ohio County Courthouses Symposium that Jeff and Nancy are both participating in. So if you want to know more about that, come see me. But really my question is, despite the Seneca County Courthouse coming down, does it feel, for being in the field for 40 years, are we winning? Does it feel to you like we're at a are we winning?
Yeah,
and also, what would you say? What would you see in about 10 years? Are there changes you see on the horizon? Are things going to move more residential, for example? What's your take on that?
I think we are winning in the sense that buildings are getting preserved that, 10, 15, 20 years ago wouldn't have. I think the preservation ethic, as we call it, sort of the concept of reusing old buildings, has become much more integrated into the planning and development process. We teach a course in city and regional planning at OSU about historic preservation, and we find a very enthusiastic response from architectural students, city and regional planning students. That's one small anecdotal story. But it really does seem to be happening. I think it's the broadening of the constituency that has contributed, principally through the investment incentives. I think it's also just trends in the country nationally, more interest in returning to the city or being in the city, the idea of not driving so much and living close to where you work, sort of the concepts preservationists honestly have been talking about for a long time. And you may have seen the promotional material where I sort of smugly said, well, the preservationists have been right all along, but I really think we have. We've been talking about these things for 40 plus years, and it really is beginning to happen. So yeah, we are.
Jeff touched a little bit on some of the demographic changes. This is purely anecdotal because it's just our experience. We're very lucky to live in a city with a very vibrant economy. So what we're saying is not necessarily true everywhere, but just having these apartments for rent, how many people are relocating to Columbus for good jobs? And even if they don't rent our apartment, they say, we want to live in the center city. We want to walk. We want to be near everything that's going on. And they're young, up to, 50s, but they are young. And this is what they want. And we're seeing even in places like German Village with young parents coming together and saying, you know what, we're not going to do what a lot of people have done and leave when our children are in school. We're going to start making this a community, make a decision about lifestyle. And I think that's where historic preservation comes across very, very well. A lot of people, and I'm speaking for my son's generation, they pick a place to live and then find a job. Columbus, to be competitive, has to have character, it has to have identity, and that's where I think preservation has something to offer. It's not the only thing, but it is a very, very critical part of it. Think of the city of Columbus without the slides of the buildings that we showed today. What would we have a city? What would our identity be?
Thank you, Jeff and Nancy. I'm Jane Scott with Metropolitan Club. In light of the levy yesterday, I'm thinking there might be some rethinking about the Scioto Peninsula and what's going to happen. I'd be very, very interested in your thoughts about Vets Memorial, reconstruction, reuse versus demolition. We have another example. Central High School was reused and incorporated into COSI. And I'm just very curious about your thoughts as preservation.
It's, that's a tough one. We haven't been involved in it, so I don't know all the details of what was looked at. I can say I've seen proposals for what it would be if it were gone. I haven't seen any exciting, really wonderful proposals of what it could become with vets there. And I don't know if that has been pursued fully. The one thing we'll say about demolition is it's forever. And we just ought to be really, really careful before we give things away and get rid of them, because bit by bit, we start losing a lot of character in the city. I don't have real strong feelings one way or the other, because I'm not as informed on that particular topic as I might, and I thought somebody would ask that question
Well,
today.
there are two questions you ask when you face an issue like that.
Yeah.
One question is, okay, have you looked at the existing building, and what is its capability of serving in the new function you're anticipating? Can it be adapted in a way? And it's, you know, it's partly a sustainability issue. Apart from historic character, sustainability, the embedded energy in the Vets Memorial is significant. It took a lot of energy to build it. It'll take a lot of energy to get rid of it, and more to build something else. So if we really want to be sustainable, you ask that first question. Then the second is, all right, if it goes away, what's going to replace it? And is it going to contribute more to the community than Vets had or has already? Is it going to be in the plus column? Better, offering us something that's better than what's there now. And those are the main questions you have to ask and answer honestly.
I'm not sure we've heard the end of that yet. I think, as you said, there may be some rethinking what happens. And our last speaker.
I think we're down to one.
My name is Gene Harmon, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm close friends with Jeff and Nancy. I've been coming to Columbus for 40 years, live in California, so I've had a chance to observe all the changes in the city over a long period of time. And by the way, incidentally, I met Andrew earlier, and he said, oh, there's another Gene Harmon who's a member here. So Andrew, if you need your name tag, I've got it. Okay? The question I have is really directed towards Jeff, and that is, could you please share with us your vision of transportation that's needed in the city to continue the growth and enhancement that you've discussed?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think I would.
Wait, you've got 1 minute.
I got 1 minute. Yes, if you have 4 hours, I'd be happy to sit down with you. Gene and I are both rail fans. I have a bias for rail. In fact, I think our mayor has a bias for rail. He was on the radio this week talking about that very subject. I do think that Columbus, to take itself to the next step, has to be a community with rail transit. It is a sign of a city that's arrived. It's a sign of a city that takes itself seriously and wants to be a greater city than it is. And I said I came here, it was a nice city, and it is a great city now, and it's really true. It can be greater, and I think a rail transit system for the city is part of becoming that greater place. For Ohio, I think we need intercity rail. So many other states are supporting it and benefiting from it. I can't understand why Ohio hasn't taken hold of the opportunities. I'll only go that far for that, but we do need rail of both kinds.
It seems like we were just getting started, huh, with those 2 questions. I hope you enjoyed today's forum. We encourage you to continue the conversation in the lobby over coffee and cookies. Once more, thank you to the Charles Y. and Francis N. Lazarus Legacy Fund and our partners, the Columbus Historical Society, the Columbus Landmarks Foundation, and the Ohio Historical Society, soon to be known as the Ohio History Connection, that's right, for their support. And let's thank our speakers, Nancy Ritchie and Jeff Darbee. And thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing you in our CMC forum tomorrow and next week. Thank you.